Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shirley Liu, and I'm the president of BCLA for a little while longer. I'm so honored to be here with you today at the end of another tremendous conference. We are privileged to hold the 2019 BC Library Conference in the city of Surrey, which is located on the traditional territories of Semiahmoo, Cutsey, Quequitlam, Coquitlam, Kikite, and Tawasin First Nations. Before we introduce our closing keynote speaker, I'm so pleased and honored to welcome two additional speakers with us today. First, I'd like to welcome and invite Minister Rob Fleming to share some remarks.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for the invitation to be here. And I want to acknowledge at the outset of my remarks that we're on the Coast Salish Peoples Territories as well, and we thank them for having us here for your conference, Day 3, the end of Day 3. And I just want to acknowledge our partners that deliver library services around the province. And you know, it's actually incredible. I am the vice chair of the Council of Ministers of Education of Canada just for this year. You don't have to get elected, it just rotates, but it's BC's turn. But we talked about library services briefly at our agenda last July, and when we talked about the state of libraries in British Columbia, I was really proud to say that in British Columbia, 99.9% of British Columbians have access to library services in their communities. And it literally blew away ministers of education and other government representatives from around the country that cannot boast of the kind of history, infrastructure, and legacy that our library system has in British Columbia. So let's keep bragging about that to the rest of Canada and other things. I also want to thank your current BC Library Association president for the next 2 hours, Shirley Liu, for her service to the organization, for her passion for library services right around British Columbia for communities that they serve, and also to congratulate the incoming president, Chris Middlemass, who will be taking over the helm. Let me congratulate and thank as well the BC Library Association board and staff for 2019-20, and the Association of BC Public Library Directors, the Library Trustees Association as well, governance partners, the BC Libraries Cooperative, and our session sponsor here this afternoon, or for the conference, QPBC, who represent library workers right across British Columbia, and they do a tremendous job as advocates for the library system. So thank you to them and their Vice President, Karen Ranaletta. So I understand that it's been a busy past few days. You've been discussing how library services and spaces are changing and evolving, how they're shaping up opportunities for British Columbians in every part of the province. And I want you to know that BC's public libraries are an important part of our government's plan to make life more affordable for British Columbians. Libraries provide opportunities for people to contribute to their communities. They help improve the literacy skills of British Columbians. They connect families. They foster social inclusion. And they reduce inequality, all things that are important to your provincial government. For a lot of British Columbians, they also help to reduce poverty. They reduce barriers to knowledge, skills, training, the ability for people to be self-reliant and gain knowledge that will help them as they try and lift themselves out of poverty and pursue opportunities. So that, I think, needs more broad recognition throughout British Columbia because it is something that libraries play a critical role. As leaders in our public libraries, it's great to see you come together to consider how you can improve services further for people, to change as technology changes, to cover more communities with innovative services. I learned bookmobiles are now available on boats in some rural parts of British Columbia, so that's pretty cool. And I want to say, as a lifelong library user, I know how important libraries are. I've got one kid in elementary school, one in middle school, and both of them are using the new curriculum in our school system, and both of them are using our library service because, of course, the emphasis now is on a lot of group-based learning, a lot of project-based work, and developing their own competencies and understanding the big ideas that have changed our world in the subject matter of which they're studying. And where do they find that out? On the weekend? Libraries. So that tie with the education system, I think, has to be made even more deliberative as we continue to talk to the sector about how we can both, as a provincial government and as a library system, continue to serve British Columbians. I've noticed getting into libraries, the development of services myself. I think a lot of people understand that libraries are more than books these days. I think that most of us understand that British Columbians, hundreds of thousands of them, benefit from libraries each and every day. And that's certainly the case with Premier Horgan, who's lobbying incessantly and shamelessly in his own constituency for better library services all the time. So he is a passionate supporter of public libraries. And I'm encouraged by the collaboration and partnerships that we're seeing between boards and staff and support organizations to help reduce barriers to help British Columbians of all ages thrive in the library system. So your network and community of support is a crucial part in ensuring that British Columbians have free, equitable access to diverse collections, services, programs, and digital resources. Also, I think something that we need to tell British Columbians, because they know it already, is that libraries are amongst our most trusted institutions that we have in our communities. They have a commitment in their library staff to make libraries function for people. They are spaces that people feel welcome in. They are integral parts of our community. They provide equity in terms of access to information and technology that is critically important in today's in today's day and age. And they also leverage so much value in terms of the volunteer time that is generated in our library system. Whether that's library trustees or whether that's volunteers who are doing fundraising to enhance local library services, just a massive network of literally thousands of people across British Columbia who are passionate about libraries and are doing work on all our behalf to improve libraries. So the success of the library system, of course, would not be possible. It would not be thriving the way it is today in British Columbia without all the work that you do. And I want to take a moment to say thanks to all of you for the incredible work and leadership that you're providing right across our province. So thank you for that. I also am loving the sunny weather outside, but with that comes risk. And I really want to thank all of you that stepped up and helped British Columbians during the grave danger that we faced last summer during the wildfire season. I know that libraries were important in some of those fire interface communities in giving people shelter, giving them a safe access out of areas of evacuation, and being able to accommodate people that were fearing for their property and their homes and their pets and their loved ones. And libraries stepped up and delivered once again for communities that were at risk. So thank you for that as well. And I certainly hope that you don't have to step up in the way that you did this summer. But it is nice to know that you are there to do so again if called upon. Last fall, I was invited to an event at the Whistler Public Library during the Union of BC Municipalities, and what a beautiful space that is, first of all. It was amazing to see regular library users coming in, and we were doing a special event there, but just to see them go about their business and how well utilized that library is, I think very typical of libraries and communities around British Columbia. But it was also neat for me to see, as the Minister of Education, some of the, when I talked about libraries not being about books, some of the interesting projects that were going on in libraries. The virtual reality technology that was available that was very well subscribed. I had like a kid pushing me out of the way to get into it, but I only took a couple minutes. It's kind of addictive, but and then there was this electrified banana put in front of me that operated a piano, which I was making music. That's not what I expected to see when I went into the library that day. And it was fascinating, and it was great, and I talked to a lot of parents and kids there, and these were kids who were so engaged in their schoolwork because they could continue learning beyond the bell schedule of their school at their public library. They learned a love of learning in school, and they were able to satisfy that and carry on with a great library in their community. So I couldn't explain what a banana piano is. I've tried my best, but something around electric circuitry, and I'll have to try it again. I was also really, really pleased to hear that last year in 2018, 63,000 kids in 200 communities participated in BC's Summer Reading Club. That's just amazing. That is incredible. So important to the goals of early learning literacy in our school system. Libraries just carry on the tradition of having learning spaces available to kids in the summer. They're so great for parents who get sick of putting their kids in day camps all the time, to be able to go to the library and do something different and do something fun and do something interesting and have their kids expand upon what they learned in school and carry that through the summer and become really, really good readers, because we know the statistics around kids who enjoy and can read well for the rest of their lives. They will enjoy success in everything they do. So thank you for that, and let's hope we can get even more kids involved this summer. There's no reason why, when there's so much momentum going on with that program. Also really proud of how many libraries have responded to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. That was, of course, thank you. It's just great to see so many library partnerships out there with First Nations communities. Reconciliation is a process. It's something incredibly important for our country in the 21st century, to understand the wrongs of previous centuries, but to get to a new place. And libraries are critically important for the ongoing process of reconciliation, and I thank you for that work. And just seeing the First Nations content and seeing First Nations communities using their libraries, being welcomed in libraries, and non-Indigenous populations learning an incredible amount about their side-by-side neighbors who lived in solitudes for way too long and are now being brought together because we have public libraries helping government with reconciliation. So thank you very much. And a great example of that, I understand, is one of the collections that the West Vancouver Memorial Library is developing now with the Squamish Nation. So what an amazing partnership. That's just one. I hate to single one out, because I know that library systems around British Columbia are starting to offer material on Indigenous history. There's lectures, there's talks, there's First Nations elders in libraries, and it's about having a dialogue on colonialism, and it's about thinking about the Canada and British Columbia we want as we reconcile with our past. So let me thank you again and wish you an incredibly successful year. I want to say thank you to all of you again. I understand you have lots of successes to be proud of over the last year. I'm aware of and really, really appreciative of the volunteer hours that you've generated in your communities, and I wish you well in sustaining and growing that in the coming year. I want to leave you with the message again on behalf of the Premier and everybody involved in our government, that we're committed to working with libraries, we're committed to working with our local government partners, with community agencies, with literacy groups, with all of our education partners, to ensure that libraries remain inspiring, available places in our communities, essential destinations where people of any age can learn and grow. And I look forward to working with all of you as we work hard to make life better for every person in British Columbia. So thank you very much.
Mr. Fleming, and thank you for being with us today. Your presence is an important reminder that you value the essential and unique role that libraries play in our communities and in educational institutions in our province. And I think I speak on behalf of the entire room how proud we are of the work we do in libraries. And it's incredible to hear these stats and be reminded that we serve 99% of our communities, but I think I speak for everyone. We'd like an even 100%, which leads to, you might want to ask Kevin for one of these pink buttons or red. He'll explain what it means, but basically 20 million in 2020, please. At this time, I'd like to express our gratitude again to QPBC for being the conference's platinum level sponsor and to sponsor the closing keynote today. I think it's fitting that our conversations the past few days about how we better serve our communities has been supported by an organization that supports our library workers. I'd like to invite Karen Ranaletta, General Vice President of QPBC, to the stage.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try and do this without my phone as much as possible. Thank you, Shirley. My name is Karen Ranaletta. I'm one of the 4 General Vice Presidents for QPBC. You may know me as a person who was trying to throw book bags at you yesterday at the trade show floor. But I am so happy to be here in my home sector. I actually grew up in Surrey, and it's my... Oh, did somebody just clap? All right, give it up for Surrey, everybody. And it is an honor to recognize the traditional territories of the Semiahmoo, the Katzie, the Coquitlam, the Kwantlen, the Kikite, and the Tsawwassen First Nations. I feel very grateful to have grown up in this area and continue to visit. So, it's awesome when there's a cabinet minister who warms up the stage for you. And I just want to make a couple of comments. You know, we're unapologetically political in CUPE, especially when we have a progressive government in place. And I want to thank the minister and your colleagues for truly being supportive of libraries and library services. We've seen across the country, whether it's been in Saskatchewan, in Newfoundland, right now in Ontario, and who knows what's going to happen in Alberta, provincial governments actively trying to destroy libraries and library services. That's a direct attack on our democracy. And I really want to thank you and the government and the Premier and the BC NDP for standing up for public services. It's pretty cool that in the middle of a session yesterday, I get a text message from a friend of mine who's the president of the BC Federation of Labour. I get this picture, and it's him with our Premier, and they're both holding up their matching library cards, and they're proud to do so, and that to me is really important. So, let me just talk a little bit about our union. There are many of you in this room who are members of CUPE or have been members of CUPE. We're more than 97,000 strong in the province of British Columbia, and we represent workers in a variety of sectors, including almost 4,000 members that work in school, public, and academic libraries. I'm very pleased to be here to bring greetings on behalf of our newly elected executive board as of last week, and I'm really happy that this term we have 3 library workers as part of our provincial executive. I want to recognize, yeah, we can clap. I'd like to recognize Sarah Bjorkness from CUPE 23, our Regional Vice President for Metro Vancouver, and Rose Yurkich, who's from CUPE 1123, our Regional Vice President for the Okanagan. And they're right there. And I'm a library worker as well. I'm a proud member of Local 2950 at UBC, so shout out to my UBC colleagues. And I've been president of my local for about 6 years. Before that, I was the assistant to the director at the Irving K. Barber Learning Center, and that's where I saw firsthand the collaboration and the partnership between public and academic libraries and their commitment to making access to information and resources available to all British Columbians. And you know, library workers have always been at the heart of progressive change and the defenders of democracy. I want to tell you a seminal piece of BC labor history that you may not know that originated in the library at UBC. In 1974, our union was the first in Canada to negotiate maternity leave top-up. It's a benefit that just didn't benefit just our members, but it has benefited families across the country. That proposal was tabled by our current second vice president, Suzanne Lester, who has been working at UBC Library since 1969, and she's here today, and I'm going to make her stand up and wave because she's the one who tabled that proposal. And I want to just take a moment to speak about one of Mr. Fleming's colleagues, Judy Darcy, the first ever Minister for Mental Health and Addictions. Did you know that Judy Darcy was a library worker before she became the president of CUPE National? She's the only library worker to have led a national trade union. And talk about someone who can speak to the importance of libraries in our communities, especially amidst the opioid crisis. We've prioritized our relationship with BCLA over the past few terms, and I want to shout out to Annette and the board for really being there for us to cultivate this relationship. We are extremely excited to partner with BCLA on the Summer Reading Club. It's a real honor for us as a trade union to follow a chartered bank as a co-sponsor. It's not normal. But it's something that means a lot to us. A lot of our members and members outside of the library sector have taught us, they'll just come and tell us how the Summer Reading Club has affected them and their families. And so it's a great initiative that not only fosters learning and reading in our communities, but also it connects us all together. And it's a great opportunity to celebrate the work of our members. So again, thank you so much for indulging me for the past few minutes, especially to our CUPE members. Thank you for the work you do in our communities. We will continue to stand up for public services, and we will continue to defend democracy. And again, thank you so much. We are all in this together, and you know, I can't wait to see what happens to the budget next year, especially after today. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Kyla, and along with Jorge, who's there, and Anne, who I can't see right there, we've had the pleasure of co-chairing this year's conference with the amazing BCLA team, so thank you to all of you. And thank you to Shirley and to Minister Fleming. Goodbye, Minister Fleming. Thank you for speaking. Thank you to Karen. As many of you know, Karen is one of the truly amazing advocates for the library sector. And as a CUPE member myself in my work in post-secondary, it means a lot to me that CUPE continues and is building its support for libraries around the province. So it's been almost 10 years since I came across the video of Emily Pilloton's TED Talk, Teaching Design for Change. This is where I get super nervous because she's so amazing. And over these years, I have recommended this video to friends and colleagues. I have shown this video in workshops, and I have watched it myself over and over again, which makes me just so thrilled for this chance to introduce Emily. With a Bachelor of Arts in Architecture from the University of California, Berkeley, and a Master of Fine Arts from the School of Art Institute of Chicago, Emily is the founder and executive director of Project H Design and the youth design initiatives Studio H and Girls Garage. She has decades of experience building with young people to envision new futures. As a designer, builder, and educator, she uses architecture and design as a vehicle to transform communities and classroom pedagogy, as well as the very communities that she has lived in through public art projects. Her focus on designing solutions with, not for, community, and ones that are appropriate for the very community she is working with, reminds me of what you, as library workers, do every day and why I'm so proud to have served as a public library trustee. Emily's work seeks to change the authorship of our built environment and cultivate power in underestimated communities, specifically young girls, undocumented youth, and communities of color. With an educational philosophy rooted in creativity, design thinking, and project-based learning, Emily works with educators and schools to reinvent teaching and learning in more hands-on and community-focused ways, which is a nice segue from Mr. Fleming's talk about education. Emily is currently a lecturer in the College of Environmental Design at the University of California, Berkeley, and the author of 3 books, as well as a forthcoming book that I may have already pre-ordered, about tools and building for young women. Her work has also been documented in a full-length feature film called If You Build It. I highly encourage your libraries to buy an educational copy if you don't already have one. And her work has been featured in the New York Times and presented to the Obama administration's Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House. And really, most impressively for me, she has been profiled on the website seriouslybadasswomen.com. So please join me in welcoming Emily.
Hi, everybody. Hi. So, quick disclaimer, I walked in the room at about 2:45 for a tech check, and we plugged in my computer, and I think I broke everything. So only this screen works, and I apologize for that. As with many other things, you are welcome to blame the American. So I'm really excited to be here. When Annette first asked me to be here, I was like, oh, God, this is totally out of my element. Why? What am I going to say about libraries? But actually, I realized, well, I'll show you some of my work, but I realized that I think some of the work that we all do in this room is very similar. And I'll just start with this. So my two grandmothers were both librarians. My mother is Chinese and my father is French. So on the left is my Chinese grandmother, on the right is my French grandmother. My grandmother, Vivette, on the right, was a librarian at her local library in New Jersey for decades. She also was a massive bibliophile, and she had one of the world's largest collections of first edition Robert Graves anthologies of poetry. And when she passed away a few years ago, it was gifted to the University of Victoria. So you can thank my grandmother for that. And then my grandmother on the left, her name was Margaret. She had a master's degree in library science. She was the head librarian at the engineering college at Notre Dame, which is where she met my grandfather. And she was like notoriously known for getting people who you would not expect to be in the library to come to the library and use it in really interesting ways. So at Notre Dame, they're very well known for their football team, and I've heard this story from my mother about 50 times, that supposedly there were all these football players who would come into the library and just like screw around and make noise and be annoying and have all their football stuff everywhere. And so my grandmother befriended them and taught them how to quilt in the library. And so as a football team with my grandmother, they made this quilt that was hung in the Notre Dame Engineering Library. So this is my heritage. My grandmothers were also just like ferocious immigrant women who lived with such vivacity and were always making something, whether it was food or cross-stitching, or my Chinese grandmother was an amazing Chinese calligrapher and soprano, and these were just two women that were constantly producing things and always learning, and they just exuded curiosity. And so I grew up looking up to these two matriarchs, and this is where my curiosity came from as well. One of the problems with curiosity, though, is that when you get to high school, when you become a teenager, and people start asking you, what are you going to study in college? For someone like me that was filled with curiosity, I wanted to do everything. I was like the varsity soccer captain. I started a Habitat for Humanity chapter. I was taking all these AP tests. I was an avid reader, but I was a nerd about science. I loved calculus. Like, how could you ever be bored in this world, right? But when you get to be this age, people start asking you that question, what are you going to do when you grow up? Actually, they start asking it a lot earlier, but in high school, you have to declare it. You have to check a box on any college applications that you're applying to. So this was like a very, very hard moment for me. The three people in this photo, I have two sisters. My sisters are here. These are three of my high school teachers who I'm still in very close contact with. And these are the first three people that validated what my grandmothers had taught me, which is that not only is it okay to be curious and it's okay to be a nerd, but that it was okay to be a nerd about everything. And that has sort of shaped the way I think about learning throughout the rest of my life. It's also how I came to discover the thing that I do now. Because while my grandmothers were librarians, my grandfathers were both engineers. My French grandfather was a chemical engineer. My Chinese grandfather was an aeronautical engineer and worked for International Harvester on various things and many pieces of farm equipment. And so I grew up sort of at the intersection of these two worlds, this like love of reading and learning and curiosity, and then also like this deep desire to make stuff and also break stuff, sometimes be able to put it back together. So this is all to say that this is how I found architecture. As a nerd about everything, with my grandfathers in one ear and my grandmothers in the other. And when I was 16 years old, I had the opportunity to travel to Central America with this group of teenagers from around the country. And it was a service project, and I was there for 3 months. And while I was there, I learned how to mix and pour concrete by hand. I learned how to frame a roof. I learned how to do basic carpentry. And I worked with these teenagers, and we built this community gazebo. And it was in a very small village where there were absolutely no gathering places. There were no formal gathering places. People would gather informally, but there was nowhere that had been built that said, this place is for our community. And so this is what that was. And we did this alongside some really incredible families who lived there. And this was like such a seminal moment for me as a young person for a couple of reasons. One, I got to do something with my hands and actually contribute something, like make something that I could stand back and look at and say, I did that, I made that. But also it like allowed me as a awkward teenager to connect who I was to my community, to the rest of the world. And it allowed me to see that I could have an impact in the world. So this was sort of the framework through which I discovered and fell in love with architecture. It was rooted in a connection to the community, in getting my hands dirty, and knowing that my identity played a part in what I was building. So fast forward, I went to UC Berkeley, I studied architecture. I went to the School of the Art Institute in Chicago and studied more architecture. When I was there, though, I had this really, a second important moment. When I was in graduate school, I had this one professor named Bob McAnulty who was he was known as like the crank on campus. He was kind of some people called him a jerk. I really loved him, but he wasn't everyone's cup of tea. And one of the things that he did with us, with my graduate class it had to have been like the first or second week of the program, is he took us to the museum, the Art Institute of Chicago. And in the Art Institute of Chicago, in the Asian art wing, there's this tiny little gallery that was designed by Tadao Ando. And most people go to the museum and they don't even know it's there. And if they do, there's two like nondescript doors. Even if you see it, you probably won't go in. But he walked us in, there were about 10 of us, and it's dead silent, it's very dim. There's 16 huge mahogany columns. And we all walked in, and he gave us a second, and he said, "Do you feel that? That is a feeling only architecture can give you." And I couldn't put my finger on what the feeling was, but it was a feeling. And it was the first time that I also, in addition to loving architecture for the building and the community, to me, that's when it also became about feeling, like a real, like full body feeling of being in a space where I felt safe and inspired. And so after graduate school, I had, like, this all sounds great, right? Great. Sounds like a great career plan. However, when I graduated from graduate school, I had $80,000 in student loans, and I have parents who expect me to grow up and not live with them. So I got a job in a corporate design firm, and for about 2.5 years, I did the sort of traditional corporate architecture trajectory. And turns out I hated it, and I'm very much not wired to work for a boss, and I'm very much not wired to work behind a desk. And so I quit after 2.5 years because I wanted architecture to feel like this again. I wanted it to feel like this room and being on that construction site in Belize when I was a teenager. So I founded a nonprofit, knowing nothing about how to run a nonprofit, nothing. I had $1,000 in savings, and I did move back in with my parents when I started the nonprofit. And I just knew in my gut that there was more to practicing architecture than arguing about doorknobs and doing plumbing details for 8 hours. These are things I actually was doing. And so I founded this nonprofit really as to put a stake in the ground for myself, to find a way to practice architecture in a different way, but more importantly, to try to find ways to connect a design practice to the public sphere, to communities, to people, to places that don't normally have access to an architect. Architecture is an incredibly elitist profession. I think like only 1% of all humans ever will interact with an architect in a professional capacity. So it was important for me to democratize what I believed the power of design could be. So what does any of this have to do with libraries? As I founded Project H and had absolutely no mission statement other than I want to do design that matters, the things that I kept coming back to were really about that feeling of what it means to be in an incredibly powerful space. And so this is one of the sort of unofficial mantras or missions of Project H, is to think about spaces, and specifically public spaces, that make us feel three things: that make us feel safe, that make us feel inspired, and that make us feel like we're part of something. So by safe, I don't just mean physically safe, I mean also like seen as a human. Does the space reflect my history? Do I see people in the space that look like me? Do I feel recognized and valued? Inspired doesn't mean like lightning bolt necessarily, but it could mean I'm inspired to create something, or to go home and have a conversation I'm scared to have, or to talk to someone in the space that doesn't look like me. Inspired to be called to action. And then lastly, to be part of something that community spaces like libraries, like all public spaces, when they work best, you're not alone in those spaces. You're a part of a network of other people, potentially of people that you don't otherwise interact with. And so this was truly what I was trying to get at with Project H. And I also realized that because of the feeling I had when I was in Belize as a young girl, I wanted to do this work with young people. I felt like there was such an opportunity to build these spaces with young people who truly are the future and will inhabit these spaces and should be able to be authors of these spaces. Okay, so I want to share with you 4 quick-ish projects that I've done that I think represent some big ideas that might be applicable in library spaces and also in the way we think about our public spaces in general. I want to ask you to suspend your instinct, whatever reflex you have to think, oh, that would never work, we don't have the money for that, we've tried that and it failed. Just like put that in your pocket until the end of my talk. Great. Okay. Okay, so the first big idea is that often, I'm speaking of the American civic systems in particular, I think it's very easy to put like 4 people at the table who are familiar, who are like, oh, they know the ropes, and you end up with the same thing you ended up with 50 years ago. I think the best projects consider radical partners and have a seat at the table for everyone, especially youth. And not just youth who we invite in the door, but youth who are truly given leadership responsibilities to make new things happen. So the best example I have of this is let's see, what year was this? This was almost 10 years ago now. I was invited by a superintendent of a public school district in rural North Carolina essentially to move there. I got this random email from this person. This is Dr. Chip Zollinger. He sent me an email, and I thought it was spam. And it said something to the effect of, hi, I'm a superintendent in rural North Carolina. Was wondering if you would come here and help me fix this district. I don't know what that looks like yet. Okay, call me. So I was like, what? Who is this person? But it was too interesting to pass up. So I did call him. It turns out he was an incredible visionary, a big believer in trying crazy renegade things that no one's ever tried before. And I can at least say for the US, this is like not a typical superintendent, right? So I did. I flew down to North Carolina. I was living in San Francisco at the time. And he was so persuasive, he did persuade me to move there with my partner. And he basically gave us free rein to think about how we could consider space, learning, and community to fix the school district that was on the verge of collapse. So what I pitched to him, completely naively, was that he let me teach a high school class. I have no training in education. My partner and I said, you know what? If we're going to talk about design, we can't just do this at this like 30,000 foot level and plop things in. This has to be something that comes from students. So we designed this curriculum, a design-build curriculum, that was connected to the community. So think of this as like shop class or vocational education, but with a community service component. So instead of building birdhouses for our moms, we're building public structures that are actually used by our community. So my students, at first, were like, who are you? What is this class? At the time, there were not enough human being teachers in this district, and many of them were taking all of their classes online, including PE. Just like think about that one for a minute. Okay. And so they were skeptical. And it was my job to build trust and to prove to them that building was a different way of learning. And so over the course of a year, we built all kinds of things. We built chicken coops. We built cornhole, those beanbag toss boards. We put up this massive billboard. We did all kinds of building projects that were all leading to this massive opus of a project where we had been asked by the mayor to build a farmer's market pavilion, a 2,000 square foot farmer's market pavilion, no big deal, right? So he had given us a plot of land that was right as you came into town, and many other people had been saying this also. This is a small town of 2,000 people. There's very little access to fresh food. There's a very high obesity rate, and I think the closest farmer's market at the time was something, let me do my metric conversion, was about 120 kilometers away. So that's really, that's a far way to go for fresh produce. So this was the ultimate goal. And my students were really excited about this also. They come from farming families. Some of them have parents that want to start businesses. Some of them wanted to start their own businesses. This is also a town where there's nowhere to gather. There's no movie theater. There's no cafe. There was no bar. Nothing. And so the Farmers Market Pavilion, for so many different people, became this idea that was appealing for a lot of different reasons. If I'm a farmer, it means one thing. If I'm the mayor, it means another. If I'm a student, it means another. And so over the course of a year, we started designing this. The previous photo was just the students making models. We went and visited a number of other farmers markets. My students learned Google SketchUp, and they started to bring some of these ideas to life. They presented that work to the public. This is one of my favorite pictures I've ever taken because this is my student Karan on the left, who was 16 at the time. And this is one of the town councilmen from this small town. And these are two people in this extremely racially divided town that I would bet my life would never have met if it were not for this project. And they're standing and looking at drawings that Karan had done of a building that the mayor had asked for, that the town councilman is dying to see made real. So you have these two folks like coming together over something that no one ever would have dreamed of. So this is the importance of having everyone have an equal seat at the table. Not like a high chair and a booster chair, like everyone gets the same seat at the table. So we showed our work. We invited in some critics. We had to figure out how to actually build this thing. I went to architecture school. I never got to do a project in architecture school that I actually built. It was incredibly infuriating. So I was excited to finally do a project where I was asking my students to design the thing, but then we had to engineer it and get a building permit and find funding and actually break ground and dig holes and cut a ribbon. So this is one of our final critiques. What we ended up with was this very, very simple structure. We got a small grant from a foundation to build this thing, and it had to be engineered in a flood zone, a hurricane zone. I guess that's it. Just those two things. And our budget was about $50,000, which sounds like a lot for a grant. It was very little to build a building, right? So this building has a lot of details. I won't bore you with like all the nerdy architectural things I love about it. But one important thing to know is that if you drive around Bertie County, one of their biggest crops is peanuts. And they have these structures, if you're driving down the road, they have these big structures that are, they have 8 bays. It's like a big roof with 8 bays, and they pull in trailers of peanuts into these shed structures. And I've never seen these peanut trailer structures anywhere else. And so when we were talking about how to think about this structure, we started using the term vernacular sublime. We wanted it to feel familiar, but also like in this elevated way. So the geometry of this building was inspired by those peanut shed trailers, but it has a couple twists. It has this double height ceiling. It has this huge front that we could use as a billboard to the town. It has this funny angle. It's not quite a rectangle that allows for a sort of a different entry, a ramped entry. And so this is what we came up with. And this is also where my architecture education stopped, right? Like you put this on the table, a bunch of architects come in and maybe make you cry and tell you it sucks or they love it or whatever, and then you go home. But this was like the 50-yard line for us, right? We actually have to build this thing. So we did. So school gets out in June. Everyone else goes and is on vacation. They're on their jet skis on the beach, and my students are digging holes. They were there every single day, all summer, at 6:30 a.m. because they knew that this was more than this was not just a homework assignment, right? They were in conversation with the mayor. They were at the building department. They were talking to farmers. This was about more than just them. So we dug these holes. We had to build these ginormous structural trusses, which, fun fact about US and North Carolina labor law, you can't operate a power tool on a construction site if you're under the age of 18. So these massive trusses we had to build in our shop on the school site. They're each made up of 27 pieces of lumber. Code them, disassemble them, move them to the site, and assemble them with mallets and hand socket wrenches. Okay, great. Another challenge, right? So they did that. There was no complaining. There was some complaining, but on the teenage spectrum, it was minimal. And then we had to lift these things into place. And this was really the day. This is one of my favorite days because as I had to learn how to drive this machine also, as we're lifting these things into the air, I have teenagers who are male, female, African American, white. I have the mayor. I have farmers. I have random people that live down the street, people driving through town, and everyone is there looking at the same thing, and everyone is excited that it's happening for different reasons. This is a project that could not have happened with all those different parties of support. And then just a quick shout out to my students for their patience. Like about a month and a half in, we were all like, I'd lost 15 pounds, I had thrown my back out twice, we were all just like, oh. But their attention to detail was just remarkable. Like this was, again, more than a homework project. When they were cutting the joists for the decking, I would say I need a joist at 95 3/8. And if you bring it to me at 95 1/4, it's too short. That cost us $22, and you have to do it again. So it was just incredible to see the commitment that youth will exhibit when they're put in a leadership role, where they know that the thing they're doing is so important, not just to them, but to their community. And then we put up this siding that would eventually become this billboard, and this is the final structure. So this opened at the end of the summer, and one thing I didn't mention is that we did not only have to build a farmer's market, we had to create a farmer's market. Like, get farmers to come to the market. And so as we were building, we had this pop-up market on the adjacent parking lot that was just people with card tables that they popped up. So as we were building, there were people coming to the site, seeing this thing happen. And on the day that we opened it, which was a Saturday, that pop-up market had been going and going. And this was the first day they got to move into the space. And one of my favorite moments, so you can kind of see there's a car tucked like on the left side of the image. So because we were in a flood zone, we had to build that deck at about a meter above what's called base flood elevation level. And because of that, I was like, oh no, now we have to build a ramp. Now we have to deal with ADA requirements for the slope of the ramp. This is gonna be a nightmare. And my student, Stevie, said to me, well, no, Miss Emily, this is great because that's the height of a truck bed. People can just pull up, drop their truck bed, and unload their stuff. And on the day of the opening, we didn't say anything to anyone. We just said, you're in spot 2, you're in spot 3, and they did exactly that. And my student, Stevie, was like, Miss Emily, they're doing the thing. And I was like, I know. It's because it was an incredible design, and you thought of something that I would never have considered. That was all you. So on that day, on the opening day, same thing as when we were building. The diversity of folks that came out for this event was such incredible validation for my students that their ideas mattered, that they had a mayor who believed in them enough to run a construction site. Like, what? And that they pulled it off, right? They're standing in this building that was like a model on their desk not that long before. And so this was the project that was like real hard proof to me that not only that kids are capable of like infinitely more than we think they are, but also they're great moderators and leaders when it comes to bringing other people to the table. It was only, if it had just been me and my partner, and I was like, hey, mayor, hey, farmer, let's get, no. The students were the ones that invited everyone to the table, that kept them part of the conversation, that made sure everyone was invested. And so spaces like this farmer's market, which is a public structure, they need that. They need the energy of youth, and they need to have all these different stakeholders who are deeply invested in totally different ways. Not everyone has to be trading in the same currency, but everyone needs to know what their role is and what their reward is and what their relationship to everyone else is. So in libraries, I mean, I think this is like something that applies to a lot of different spaces. I mean, there's so many different ways that you can think about this, that you can think about bringing in new partners, that you can think about involving students. I know a lot of most libraries, and just based on what I had heard from the minister, I know that most libraries have incredible education and youth outreach programs. But I would challenge to think about what the current limits of those relationships are and how to push them even further. This is just me and my brainstorming, thinking of ways in which this could occur in a library space. Okay, so the second story is actually a slightly more somber one. I think that one of the things that public spaces can do is to create places of healing. And we see this in things like memorials. We see this in some of our religious spaces. But I think that the public spaces we create and run and inhabit can do an intentional job of making space for people to bring their stories, to bring their fears and their traumas, and to find support in these places. So what do I mean by this? A couple years ago, I had a group of students who were 9th and 10th graders. So they're 14 and 15-year-olds. And this is after I had left North Carolina. That's a whole other presentation. But I left North Carolina after 3 years, and I brought the same design build program to a school in the Bay Area in Berkeley, California. And the student population there, it was majority Spanish-speaking, recent Mexican immigrants, undocumented youth. And Berkeley is seen as a very progressive place, but its northern neighbor, Richmond, is a majority Mexican immigrants, and it has a really big housing problem. And there's just not enough housing stock to begin with, and the affordable housing stock in particular is incredibly limited. So I had a number of students who had identified as homeless, who were living in one-bedroom houses with 4 generations packed into one room, who were sleeping on friends' sofas, who had been in foster care, and on and on and on. And this, as a teacher, or as a public servant of any kind, it's very difficult to do your job when you know people are walking in the door with that kind of home or family life. I can't ignore that. I can't teach you calculus, given that I know that you're dealing with this thing. And so instead of trying to shy away from that, I asked them, we had a conversation about what home meant to them, what the idea of home meant. And that conversation was about safety and family and security. And so the project that I pitched to them, actually that they pitched to me, came at this perfect time. We had gotten this very serendipitous email from an organization that houses homeless individuals for 3 to 6 months on a transitional basis in these like tiny little huts, tiny homes. And they said, hey, we have spots for 25 tiny homes, but we only have 24 built. Would you be willing to build one? So I told my students about this, and they were like, yes, this is incredible. We had just been talking about housing. Housing with a capital H, and also like home with a little h, right? So this is one of the men that lives at that particular facility. These are the types of quote, tiny homes. This is barely even a tiny home. This is really more of a tent. So my students learned more about the organization. They did some interviews, and they started designing their own idea of home. And I think it's really easy whenever we do work for the social good or for charity. It's very easy to say like, oh, well, this is good enough for them. This is good enough for those people. Like, this is horrible, right? But we see a lot of this. My students had such a different take on this. They were thinking about home and the space of a home as a place of dignity, because that's what they wanted in their own homes. And they were thinking about not just, oh, is it good enough for those people, but is it good enough for me? Like, would I want to live there? What do I want out of my home space, and what does any human deserve? So they went through all the same thing, model making. The architecture and design here is really just like the vehicle for the larger conversation. I could be talking about filmmaking or any other medium. What's important, I think, is all of the work that surrounds it. Tons and tons of models. My students got sick of me saying, oh, that's good, do it 50 more times. That's like I'm surprised they haven't made me that t-shirt yet. And all along the way, talking about our work, putting up, here's my idea for an ideal home, here's what I think we can feasibly build, here's what it means to me, would I want to live there, what would it feel like? So this was highly personal. And then this is similar to the moment with the trusses going in the air for the farmer's market. This is like the day that the thing becomes real. It's like it rises up out of the ground. So my students started building these houses. There were 85 students working on this project. So I was like, let's make it 2 houses. So we just like did 2 houses because there wasn't enough work for 85 students. And it's also incredible to see people, young and old, work on projects that do feel personal. I think this is like one of the problems with the way designers and architects think is like, I can remove myself from the client, but actually the best work is where you do see yourself in it and you identify your own life in the work. This is my student Tanisha, who she was obsessed. She had this whole Pinterest board of furniture made from pallet wood. Like, I'm sure you've seen this type of wood, right? I hate pallet wood so much. It's all different. There's stuff sticking out of it. It's like a recipe for tetanus. Like, it's all bad, right? So, but she was like, Miss Emily, I really, really want to do pallet wood. Like, it just showed me her Pinterest board. I'm like, okay, fine, as long as I don't have to touch it, right? So one of our other students whose father worked in a factory, in a warehouse, donated 250 pallets. And Tanisha and this other small crew meticulously took every single one of them apart, cut them down, planed some of them, pieced them all together like this, stained them, and this was the final home, ×2, which you'll see in a minute. And some of the stories, you could look at this and not know the story and go, oh, that thing's cool, tiny homes are hip right now. But there were some really interesting details that did come from individual students' stories and trauma and hopes. So the windows, which are sort of run across the top, and then there's this vertical doorway. One of the things that our students said is, it's really hard living with 4 generations of people packed in one space. I'm always trying to balance my own privacy with being a good family member. So there are all these conversations about the importance of privacy, but also the importance of being part of a community and how to have both. So the windows were actually a direct result of that conversation. We wanted this space to be naturally lit, to feel open and warm, but also safe and private enough that the person living in there didn't feel like they were in a fishbowl, right? So that's where that particular geometry came from. Here are the 2 houses together. So I do think that, again, this isn't just about tiny homes or public spaces in general. This is about how we acknowledge people's stories and how people are able to see their own stories in public spaces. This is the individual who's actually living in one of the homes now. So for libraries, this, and all the spaces that we inhabit, this could mean any number of things. It means doing a lot of the things I know that you all already do, but also being highly intentional and also inviting and overt about inviting people in with specific purposes. Maybe it's affinity groups, or there's a big push in parts of the Bay Area to have restorative justice circles in our libraries. Libraries are a very trusted and safe space for people, so how can we use that as to our advantage to try to heal some of the things in our communities? Okay, so big idea number 3. This is my most library relevant story. So this was actually a year before the tiny homes, I had a group of 8th graders. 8th graders so these are like 13-year-olds. I can honestly say I never want to teach 8th grade again. If anyone here has taught 8th grade, like 8th graders are great, but they think they're like fully human and they're just not, right? So this was a tough year for me. But the project was incredible, and I would say like the ideas that these 8th graders brought to this project were like truly mind-blowing. One of the things they taught me is this idea that everything is open to invitation and editing. This is true of teenagers who like draw on walls and spray paint things. Like the world is a canvas, right? So I had this group of 8th graders, and we were in the middle school, which had just been renovated. There was a room that had been designated to be the school library, but then the school ran out of funding before they were able to stock it with books. So it was just sitting there as an empty room. It was being used as storage. And the students were really mad about this. They were like, we were promised a library. Where's our library? What the heck? And I said, okay, let's make that our project. We're going to build the library. And we did. The first thing we did is to go to the local public library as a field trip, as a precedent study, to look at what a library is supposed to look like, and then question whether that's what we wanted our library to look like. So these are 2 of my students who, after they left the library, this is one of the main branches of the Berkeley Public Library, they left, and of course their first comment was, oh my God, it's so quiet in there. I was like, well, it wasn't quiet when you were in there, but yes. They said, the other thing is that most libraries, to them as teenagers, feel very, I forget the word they use, but like formulaic. Like you walk in, you're looking for a book, you find the code, you find the book, you check it out, you leave. It felt like you had to know what you were doing. And to them, that was backwards. As 13-year-olds, they were like all about discovery. They wanted to just like stumble upon something, or maybe there's like a video game corner. They wanted the library to feel more unscripted. And so we started this project to sort of rethink what a library could be in a middle school. And they started making these models, like all kinds of different ideas. Can we hang the books from the ceiling? Can we display them facing forward? Can we just throw them in a pile? Do we have to have shelves at all? Can the librarian be me? It was amazing. If you ever need inspiration, just ask a 13-year-old. And what they came up with was actually pretty brilliant. So there were 105 8th graders, and there's one library. And I'm like, how am I going to design a library where 105 kids all feel like they played a part in making this thing? So their solution actually was that because there were 105 of them, instead of designing the whole space as one thing, they designed this one module, this like X-shaped building block that they could put together almost like Legos and make all kinds of things. So I have a friend who has a CNC router, and I called him and was like, hey, Carl, can I borrow your CNC router for like about 6 days straight to make 400 of these X-shaped module things? He was like, sure. So we did that. I brought a bunch of 13-year-olds with me to his shop. And then we started playing with how these things get pieced together. Are they a small shelf like this? Is it a larger shelf like this? You'll also notice that these shelves are not horizontal. They're at 45-degree angles. This came from a student who, his critique was that you always know where things are in the library. And I was like, many people think that's an advantage, but okay. He wanted to just go in and have to look for stuff. And so this was actually his idea, that if you had to turn your head and like sift through things, books that were on top of it, you would have to engage with other books. Okay, so it could be a shelf. It could be a shelf/bench. It could be a desk with a folding top. And as we started to piece these things together and tell the rest of the school, the 6th and 7th graders, like, hey, we're building the library, people started using it as a library. You'll notice there are no books on the shelf, but they would come in, and it became their reading space, which was so interesting. Like, so even before there were books in it, it was being treated as this place of learning that was, and everyone understood it was a work in progress. One of the student art groups used it to display a bunch of zines that they made. And then when it was finished, I'm putting finished in quotes, there were shelves along the wall and books on the shelves. But my favorite part about this whole project is that the photo I just showed you, this one, this is like about 2 years ago. And I went in there the other day. It looks nothing like this. People have taken apart shelves. They've built new shelves. Apparently there was a kid that said, hey, how come there isn't a manga, like an anime? Oh, I don't know what that is, but that thing. There wasn't comic books. There was no graphic novel section, so they just built a shelf and put the books in there. So, like, in many ways, like, the architect in me and, like, the organized person in me feels like this is a nightmare. But it is so much exactly what the students wanted, right? The whole point is that this is designed for flexibility. It's designed for discovery. You may come in there thinking you know what book you want, and either you can't find it, or you find another one, or you don't know, right? Again, nightmare to probably everyone in this room. But to 13-year-olds, this is the type of library experience that they really wanted. So I took a lot of lessons from this because I'm a very organized person, and I really had to leave that at the door and trust that they were creating spaces that were meaningful to them. The one lesson I did really take away, and I try to do in my own work now, is to embrace the element of surprise. In my new space, which I'll show you in a minute, I often will just randomly paint something red, or put up a chalkboard wall with a question and ask people to engage with it. I'm constantly trying to think of ways in which the space can change and alter people's interaction with it. And also signal to people that this is not a fixed place. You have a place in it. This is actually a template that you get to be a part of making. I think that's the most important part, is that people feel that they're a part of their own built environments. Okay, and then lastly, because I'm a nerdy builder architect person, I want to make a case for having spaces for making in public spaces. So there are a number of libraries in many countries, and in the US more recently, that have allocated space for maker spaces. And I know this is happening in various ways in Canada as well. So I think about this not just because making is fun, making is a great way for kids to engage, but it's also, to me, it's a great act of hope. If you can give folks the tools to make things that they believe in, you're giving them the tools to build the world they want to see. So this is manifested for me in a really, really special way that is I truly believe this is my life's work. Inspired by the projects I just showed you, I started working specifically with young girls. And I opened a space called Girls Garage that is about, I'm going to say 3,600 square feet, but that probably means nothing. It's about this big. And it's a place for girls to come to feel safe, to use power tools, to weld, to use chop saws, to build things, and to do brave things together. So when I occupied this space, it used to be a martial arts studio. It was a mess. It had blank white walls, and I had to think about what I wanted this space to embody and what I wanted it to visually communicate to any girl who walked in the door. So these are some of my, yeah. That little one on the left is fierce, right? She's not to be messed with. So our walls look like this. This is the opposite of the library I just showed you, right? Everything has a place, but there's a reason for this also. There's also a reason for things to be ordered. I want to remove every barrier for a 12-year-old girl who walks in and says, hey, I want to learn how to weld. You don't need to be worrying about where the hammers or pencils are or if the space is going to be clean. So I'm going to solve those problems for you. This is one way we do that. Another way we do that is that every girl who comes into the space has her name on the wall. This is a direct signal that you are a part of this space. Physically, your name, you're a part of this space, and you're also a part of this whole wall of other tiles, other girls, other parents, funders, partners, people that believe in you. So what do we do in this space? So we have a lot of power tools. You could substitute these power tools for anything else, for paper circuits, for coding, for filmmaking, for screen printing. We also do screen printing. But really, like, the purpose of the space is to make safe, intentional space for bravery. And this is Alma learning how to use a chop saw. The blade is bigger than her head. She's terrified the first time she did it. The wall that she's facing is the wall that says "Fear less, build more." It's not an accident that the chop saw is in front of that wall. We also do welding, right? So welding is like this superhuman thing that if I'm 9 and you are telling me there are 2 pieces of metal and I'm going to turn them into one, like, I'm a superhero, right? If I can do that, what can't I do? So this is another activity we do. We try to, again, like, this is the post-welding shot. I often take pictures of girls before they weld for the first time and then immediately after, and they're like different humans. It's amazing. And then I would say most importantly, this is a space where, yes, it's about skills, yes, it's about making, but perhaps most importantly, it's about community. It's about the community within the walls and then also how that community connects to the community outside. So these are 20-something girls, 24 girls, who are all 9 to 13 years old. None of them had ever used a tool before. And we were asked by the local women's shelter to build shelves for their lobby area, one for donated clothing and one for pamphlets that were resources that they could access. And so each of the girls, if you were to count each of those modules, there's the same number of squares as there are girls. So each girl built one of those modules, and we put them all together. So this is both like a very metaphorical symbol for the whole being greater than the sum of the parts. But this is also something that came out of a community of girls, but it is intended to live in the community beyond just us. So this is another way I think we can think about space, is like what happens inside and what happens between the inside and outside. This is just the last project I have, which is a greenhouse. This was sort of commissioned by a local community garden that asked us to build a greenhouse. Turns out the greenhouse, which is there and it's in use, is in use by other teenagers who are part of an apprenticeship program, and some of our students have been enrolled in both. So this is also, like, I love this project because for the girls who are enrolled in both, it's like, yes, this is something for my community, but I'm a part of both communities. So I'm both the designer, the builder, the beneficiary, and this is something that came from me. So I love the idea that spaces can hold this type of bravery, and that the act of making and, like, working with our hands and manifesting something out of nothing is, like, one of the greatest actions in hope. So I'm happy. I would love to talk to anyone, like, via email or in person about, like, the logistics of setting up a makerspace. I think there are some things that are, like, everyone wants movable tables, like, that's a thing, and sometimes that works, but also, like, just bolt the tables down and say this happens here. Anyway, I have lots of thoughts on these things. But I think more importantly, it's the culture around making that matters. It doesn't matter so much what materials are on the table. It matters who the mentors are. Do kids or people walk in and identify with the folks who are there to help them? Are those projects connected to something larger? Like, are we literally just making paper circuits? Or are those paper circuits, do those paper circuits have a purpose? Are we making greeting cards that we're sending to our elected officials or to our grandparents? I think there's always a way to connect making to something outside of just that moment of making. Last thought. So also at Girls Garage, we have this poster. This is above our water cooler. And just to tie this right back to my grandparents, this is something my grandmother used to say. And I actually think it's a Nigerian proverb, so she poached it, but I attribute it to my grandmother. And we have this up in the Girls Garage space because I think this, like, so perfectly sums up the way I think about space and the way I think about humans inhabiting space. That libraries are not just about books, right? They're about people, and people are not just a bullet point list of their identifying characteristics. Every human is their own library that we all have just in this room, like millions and millions of stories. And so the spaces that we design can't just be for books or people, they have to also be for stories. And I'll just end with this. So has anyone seen this image? Okay, so I was listening to this podcast on the plane on my way here, and I just threw this in this morning because I wanted to share it. So this is the Haskell Free Library. Have folks heard of this place? Okay. I had not heard of this place. So this is a library that literally straddles the US-Canada border. Half of it is in Quebec, and half of it is in Vermont. And it was built in, I think it was 1904, by the Haskell family on purpose on the border as a way for people to share space. So this image, though, is from very recently. As you know, the US has this ridiculous travel ban, and we can't even keep track of the countries that are on the list. It changes so often, it's just ridiculous. One of the countries that's always been on the list is Iran. And yet there are a ton of Iranian students who are in the US on student visas. But those student visas do not allow them to come and then fly home for the holidays or fly home for the summer. You're here until you're done with your degree. So that means their families can't come visit them because of the travel ban, and they can't go home to visit their families. And so this library on the border has become the place where they meet, because family members from Iran can fly into Canada, they can drive to the Canadian side of this library, their child can walk in the door on the US side, and they meet in the middle. That black line is literally where the border is. So when I heard this story, this to me embodies this would not have happened in any other place. This wouldn't happen in a supermarket. I don't even think this would happen in a post office, right? There's something about the library that is a place of solace, a place of quiet. In this instance, this is the closest place that feels like home, right? This is where your family is. I don't think that could have happened in any other place. So I was listening to this and sobbing on the plane, and it also just gave me such great hope, and it was so serendipitous that I'm here talking to you. Everyone in this room is responsible for making spaces like this, and I hope that we can all do that with great excitement and love and dignity. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, maybe one more time. Thank you, Emily. I can definitely say that I would like to fear less and build more. So thank you so much. Just before we all head out, I'm going to call up Chris Middlemass, your new BCLA president, for some closing remarks. And then Emily will be around for a little while after if you do have questions and want to chat with her a bit. So Chris, thank you.
And here I am again, for those of you who are at the AGM. For some reason, I keep carrying this pen with me. I'm not really sure why, since none of you have given me anything to do to write down. So I'm really here to thank a number of people. I want to thank, once again, the Conference Planning Committee, Jorge Cardenas, Ann O'Shea, and Kyla Epstein. Please give them a hand. They designed the wagon. And now the BCLA staff, Annette DeFavre, Angie Iapova, and Cynthia Ford, who, of course, put the wheels on the wagon. Thank you. And I want to thank the conference presenters, the conveners, the volunteers, and all of you delegates, because your energy, your ideas, your commitment, your stamina, all made this a fantastic conference, and it wouldn't exist without you. So thank you. Give yourselves a hand. And of course, I want to thank those of you who are leaving the BCLA board. I'm living proof that you might be leaving, but there's plenty of other roles. and other opportunities and other years. And I basically had only one left, didn't I? I'd worked through them all. And so now here I am as a retired librarian with time to be the BCLA president. So you haven't actually escaped. We will find opportunities for you to come on back. So it's farewell for now. And we will, welcome you back in future times. And so finally, I'd like to say in closing, we'd like to see you next year at the BCLA Library Conference, and I hope we see you all again. Thank you very much. Phew.